Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guests today are Professor David Schaefer and Dr. David Kern, two of the co-founders of 4D Molecular Therapeutics. For the sake of convenience, I will address David Schaefer as Dave and David Kern as David. I have known them both for a while now and benefited from their mentorship over the years. 4DMT is a gene therapy company with a discovery platform that helps customize their adeno-associated viruses, AAV vectors, to target specific tissue types associated with the underlying diseases. They're targeting both rare and major market diseases using gene therapy. They raised $193 million in an upsized IPO in December 2020 in the midst of a pandemic. In this episode, we will talk about the story behind founding 4DMT, their disease-first approach to product discovery and development, partnerships they built with pharma and biotech companies, crossover investors they raised money from, challenges they had to overcome during this journey, and the reasons behind going for an IPO instead of raising more venture capital money, and of course, some future plans. Both Dave and David are serial entrepreneurs, so I'm hoping that we will get to learn a lot from their experiences over the years. They also actively mentor academic entrepreneurs, so I hope you will learn and enjoy this conversation. Dave Schaefer, David Kern, welcome to the show. I was getting stressed about how I can do justice capturing both of your experiences during this podcast. Both of you are highly accomplished in your own rights. It'll be a missed opportunity not to ask about your personal transition to becoming entrepreneurs. Dave, you're still a faculty and administrator and a mentor, one of the most important points for me. And David, you took a startup to IPO, still running it, involved in philanthropy. And like Dave, you're also making efforts to mentor early stage entrepreneurs. I don't know which one is harder, but love to hear both of your backgrounds that got you to 4DMT. How did you both meet? And then we'll dive into 4DMT.
How early do you want me to start?
Start with faculty. I think that'll be a nice point because you started as to teach and then let's go from there.
Sure. Well, I've been at Cal now as a professor for 22 years. At the interface between departments, my life seems to be defined by interfaces. So chemical engineering, bioengineering, molecular and cell biology. And I always knew that I wanted our lab to be the interface between basic sciences and technology development. I really had two goals in my career. One was to develop really good people, smart people. Berkeley's a terrific place to do that, especially. And also to have a positive impact on human health and address unmet medical need. I started out by trying to identify what were huge problems, what I felt were important problems to tackle within the field, and then applied our background and mindset to be able to take on those problems. And I always knew that I wanted the results of our work to transition from the public sector to the private sector, because you need to get to the private sector, obviously, in order to develop products that benefit humanity. I didn't know, at least early on, how active a role I personally was going to play in that transition. I know I wanted to be involved either in licensing our technology or being involved in actually taking the technology into the private sector. And so David and I met at a QB3 event, ironically, a number of years ago, started talking and then started setting up some phone calls and talking about gene therapy, which at that time was not yet broadly recognized as the large field that it is today within industry.
When was this?
This is about 2012. I think we first started having some conversations, 2012, 2013. And one thing led to another. The timing was right. It was perfect to start up the company. And so we incorporated December 2013 and have been racing forward and advancing the company ever since.
Thank you. David, let's start you from after your MD PhD. You didn't practice medicine, did you, afterwards?
Well, I did for a while. So, my background is I've been in the industry and academia for about 30 years. I'm a physician scientist and a drug developer, as well as a biotech entrepreneur. And throughout my career, I've always known that I wanted to be at that intersection between medicine and human therapeutics and great science. Early in my career at UCS Berkeley and then UCSF and Harvard, I really thought that I would stay in academic medicine. But during my fellowship at UCSF in oncology, I was introduced to an entrepreneur named Frank McCormick, who actually became eventually head of the cancer center at UCSF. And he had just started a company called Onyx. It was the first molecular oncology company out there. And it was just filled with phenomenal scientists. I think I was probably employee number 10 to 12, somewhere in there, but, phenomenal postdocs and scientists. And we believed we could change the world. And so I really, at that point, just fell in love with the concept of biotech. I loved the focus on human therapeutics. I loved the teamwork and the team aspect. I've always loved team sports. So I really fell in love with the idea. I jumped to biotech, the industry side, close to 30 years ago now, and just I've loved it ever since. So I always try to keep a hand in academia. Fortunate to be an adjunct professor at Berkeley now, and I love teaching, but really my passion is helping to create and build platform therapeutic companies, particularly in the viral vector and in gene therapy space, which is sort of how I found Dave. And we've been going strong on a few companies ever since.
Great. I know that 4DMT is not your first startups. So as a team, I would like you to try and knit stories from your experiences from the past that helped you get to 4DMT. We will touch upon a few ideas throughout the show. I don't want to keep it linear, so we'll try to extract themes that you learn as you go. David, tell us about 4DMT. Starting with the name, what does 4DMT stand for?
Well, one of the great things about starting new companies is you get to name them and you get to pick who you work with. So Dave and I met, as he said, and really realized it was a very synergistic partnership. I had a long history as a clinician scientist and developing human therapeutics and building and growing platform companies. And he was really a world leader in gene therapy, a world leader in bioengineering, and had a real vision that I thought together we could create a great company. So that's really been a lot of fun. When I met Dave, I said, well, gee, Dave, we both want to do something big here in gene therapy with viral vectors. What are the biggest problems for the field? And Dave said, well, there's a joke in gene therapy that there's only 3 problems, and that's delivery, and delivery. That was pretty funny. And the concept was that we would apply Dave's directed evolution technology to solve that problem. So for whatever reason, those 3Ds and then the D of directed evolution kind of came to us to call it 4D. We tested it with some people. They loved it, and it stuck. So ever since, we've been 4D molecular therapeutics.
And what do you do at 4DMT? And Dave, please jump in to talk about the underlying technology that you developed.
Yeah, maybe I'll let Dave cover that.
Yes, when I started my lab back in 1999 here at UC Berkeley, and I'm an entrepreneur. I like taking risk. And so gene therapy was pretty risky, especially back then. And at that time, people recognized that delivery was the big challenge. That was the big problem, that you could, any number of genetic diseases where you could pin the blame on a mutated gene, a broken gene. And so if you could deliver the correct copy of the gene, it could be a medicine. It could be potentially a cure for that disease. And the big problem was, how do you deliver it? So people would begin to work with viruses, pretty harmless viruses compared to SARS-CoV-2, and delete chunks of the viral genome and swap in a therapeutic chunk of DNA and then trick those viruses into delivering a therapy rather than their own genes. And the field had arrived on the idea that there was this one particular virus, which is really harmless, called AAV. 90% of humanity has been infected with it before and never even noticed it. It's not a pathogen. And people had begun to develop it into a therapeutic gene delivery vehicle. So I entered into the field and began to work with AAV about the mid-90s or so, which is when it was really starting to get a bit noticed. And had a couple of hypotheses, or maybe leaps of faith. One was that gene therapy was going to be big someday. So that was my first leap of faith. Second is that AAV was going to be a really promising vehicle, and it was going to make some of the success in gene therapy possible. And third was that the natural versions of AAV weren't going to be good enough, that they haven't evolved for any particular purpose that's anything related to medicine. And I felt that we could do better. So I came from chemical engineering, and chemical engineering is really the place where protein engineering was born as a field. And there were protein engineers working on enzymes, working on antibodies. And right around that time, in the early to mid 90s, this new approach began to emerge. This idea that your first option is to crystallize your protein, stare at the crystal structure for a while, come up with ideas for where you can make amino acid changes in order to beneficially change the properties of that protein. And that's really slow. It's kind of like one at a time, educated guesses one at a time. So there was another investigator she's actually a graduate of my department at UC Berkeley, became a faculty at Caltech. And Frances Arnold is her name, invented this concept of using or simulating evolution in the lab, using evolution as a tool to create better versions of biomolecules, which has obviously been happening on our planet for 4 billion years plus. So what she began to do is, if you want to take an enzyme and try to change its properties, you can take the DNA that encodes it, randomly mutate it, create a very, very large library, and then use a high throughput approach to be able to identify or select the fittest, the ones that have taken steps closer to the property that you would like it to have. And then you can do this iteratively, round after round after round, and climb back up in some peak and some property that you would like that molecule to acquire. So I was entering into the gene therapy field. I was young. Gene therapy was kind of risky. AAV was a little risky. And certainly this heretical idea of applying evolution and going away from the natural versions of AAV, which everybody thought were going to solve the problem back then, was risky. So fast forward 22 years, and that approach worked even better than I'd hoped for. The field gene therapy has become successful. AAV is part of the reason, significant part of the reason it is successful. And people began to recognize about 10 years ago that the natural versions of AAV weren't going to be good enough. And we had this technology that was ready to deploy in industry to take those versions and make them much better as human medicines. So that's the technology that became the basis of 4D back in 2013.
And that was 22 years of research in your lab.
It was 14 years of research in my lab before hopping into 4D.
So that's a nice segue. Probably David can jump in. Like, maybe you can build up the story for us in terms of like, okay, what happened during this research? Was there an inflection point that you both decided that we need to start a company? And probably David, you can go into what 4DMT does as well.
Sure. So again, my background was I had started and built and had exits from platform therapeutics companies using viral vectors, both as gene therapy and oncolytic viruses. And so, I'd sold my last company. I was looking for the next big thing in viral therapeutics and was networking, which all good entrepreneurs do, and heard about what Dave was doing over at Berkeley from the folks at QB3 and realized immediately the power of this approach, that you could use a high throughput design approach to discover highly optimized variants without having to understand the underlying biology or methodically walk your way through, that you could use this directed evolution to create entirely new biology that had a number of optimal features that you wanted. And so I think we knew right away we wanted to start this company. I think what we struggled with, and we really wanted to translate this into human therapeutics in a broad way. We didn't want to bet the farm on a single product or even therapeutic area. We wanted to diversify. We wanted to have multiple shots on goal with different products, both rare and large market opportunities that had been de-risked. And so that was our vision from the beginning. As Dave mentioned, each technology goes through a boom and a bust cycle, and then an eventual resurgence for successful technologies. And AAV had been through that boom and bust cycle and was just coming out of it when we started the company. And so, believe it or not, now it's hard to believe that now everybody believes that you need better vectors, targeted vectors, and that 4D can lead the way in that. But when we first started, there were literally people out there who said conventional AAVs that were simply present in nature that did not evolve as human therapeutics would be good enough. And so I think that was our initial challenge, is finding the people who believed that better vectors were going to be necessary. And then over time, we got data to support our approach. And simultaneously, I think the field saw that there were still limitations with the first generation AAV. And because of that, it put us in a unique leadership position to really lead that next wave of companies with more targeted and optimized vectors and products. And so I think our timing as a company was was pretty good. As Dave said, people believed in AAV, and then it was just a matter of time when they realized that they needed better vectors and that we were the company that could provide that. So now where we sit today, 8 years later, is 3 products currently in the clinic, for 2 in ophthalmology and 1 for lysosomal storage disease, and another 2 products, 1 for wet AMD and 1 for cystic fibrosis, that will enter clinical development by the end of the year. So it's just, our team's been incredibly productive in translating this great science into product opportunities and getting these things manufactured and scaled and into the clinic.
Wow, that's a lot of work. Disease conditions they're going after. Maybe that brings up a point that I wanted to raise. I saw it on your website. You have a disease-first approach to product discovery and development. What does that mean, and how is it different from what others are doing, other therapeutic companies are doing?
So the way that the field had really been working was that we got this natural versions of AAV. We really don't know what they've been selected for within nature. AAV is a pretty mild respiratory virus. Again, it doesn't cause any symptoms. So if you take something that has gained experience within nature for being able to infect a lung epithelial cell, and not very good at it, incidentally, to expect it to be able to efficiently infect a photoreceptor neuron or a glial cell in the brain or a cardiomyocyte is asking a lot of this virus that didn't evolve for that purpose. So people were taking a few natural versions of the virus and shooting them into the body and seeing where they went. And then they would say, well, okay, we have this virus that's okay at getting to the liver, or this one's kind of so-so at getting to skeletal muscle. And they would choose disease targets that would be the best options for a vector that wasn't that great. So you kind of do the best you can with what you have to work with. And that's why really gene therapy wasn't succeeding with AAV for a number of years, because the vectors, the delivery technology was not doing full justice to the ingenuity and hard work of the clinicians who were trying to advance it to the clinic. So we began to take a disease-first approach, which is that you identify a clinical target where there's a significant unmet medical need. You ask, do any of the natural vectors of AAV make it to that target tissue? The answer is usually no. So let's go out and make one that does it. So we could use what we call forward engineering, decide what we wanted to make as the end product and engineer it forward so that we could be able to get there and create a brand new vector that has the profile, the properties that we needed to have to go after that tissue target or that disease target. So instead of being constrained by the limitations of natural AAVs and being forced to go where they could barely take you, we had the opportunity to go out and design our own delivery technology that was tailored to the needs of specific therapeutic areas or disease targets.
Thank you for that. And you said we'll go ahead and make one. Give us the scale of like, how hard is that problem to make one delivery vector? Like, how many do you have to make before you pick one? And how do you scale that to be uniform?
Yeah, the technology has been under development since literally the year 1999. And initially, we went through a proof of concept phase in my lab at Berkeley, where we did it in cell culture. And then we graduated to mice and then began to work with a non-human primate, especially at 4D, with the idea that evolution teaches you get what you select for. That's one of Francis Arnold's saying, Francis, who won the Nobel Prize for inventing directed evolution. And so we wanted to select in the best available clinical model prior to heading into human clinical trials. So to be able to do that, you needed a big library, because what comes out is only as good as what goes in. And then we needed really good selection technologies. So the library has been building up over the years. It's actually, the library of AAV has over 1 billion variants now at 4D. And it's actually composed of 40 individual smaller libraries, each of which makes changes to the viral properties, the viral structure, in a variety of different ways. So we go into a high throughput selection with 1 billion shots on goal. And then we'll do the selections typically within a non-human primate, which is a model that's closest to human. And then pull the needle out of the haystack, find the small handful of variants through doing these iterative selections where in this evolutionary process, you converge from 1 billion variants down to just a small handful that have the properties you want them to have. And then you pick your lead and begin to do clinical development.
Nice. Maybe you can tell the story there. So you have come up with all these new vectors, there was a disease condition, and then what did the transition look like to the startup? Were you just able to just hand over the technology to David? Did he run with it, or what was your involvement during that process? And tell that story.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with the company. I think David would probably attest to that. Within the first 3 years, I was really spending a lot of time. I continue to spend a lot of time, but especially during those first 3 years, I was nonstop on call. So did play a role, obviously, in taking the technology into the company, in hiring some of the first key people. And the development wasn't done, in that the technology needed to be scaled and needed to be implemented within primates, which we had not been doing to a significant extent within my lab at Berkeley. So it took effort to be able to get it to work within a primate model. It took effort manufacture the library in a way that was up to industry scale and quality control. And it took effort to develop quantitative, rigorous metrics to characterize the variants that came out of the process. And that process of industrialization is something that we needed to do at the company to get the technology, which was working quite well in mouse, to work in a really good way within non-human primate, to the point where we felt confident and felt really good about taking the resulting technology into human.
Nice. I see that you had two other co-founders, Melissa and Teresa, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
David, can you talk about the team building process from there? The technology has taken over, you started 4DMT. How did you build that company ground up from there?
Well, as you mentioned, building a team is absolutely critical for success, particularly as a CEO. Your job is to really set a vision, a compelling vision, and then recruit great people and then make the difficult decisions. But I think that building the team is really core to the entrepreneur and CEO's job. One of the great things about having a long, varied career is that it builds your network, and you meet people along the way in academia and in companies that say, gee, I'd like to work with them one day. So when you decide to start a company, you have a list of people you can call. And then once you've done a startup or two or three, you have a number of people where you've built that trust that you can build something great together. There's just no substitute for having been in the battles and the really, really tough times that come with somebody and knowing how they respond. Do they dig in and do their job, and are they flexible and calm under pressure and do what's necessary to get you to the finish line, or do they bail? So when you find co-founders like Dave and I have now done several companies together, Teresa Janke with 4D, again, several companies together. They're worth their weight in gold, really, because you just know you can build something out together. I think one of the things you look for in an early stage senior executive is somebody who can wear a lot of different hats and who's flexible in terms of where their role is. Because, at the starting phase, you really need people who can do a lot of different things for you, right? You don't have the money to build a fully integrated, fully functional executive team. So you need these people who can do lots of different things. And then they need to have, if you want to keep them with the company, they then have to have the humility and the maturity to say, hey, over time, my job is going to change and narrow. And so you mentioned Teresa, she started as our finance person, operations person. She then had a time as COO, then CBO, then chief of strategy, and now chief of staff. So I think that's an example of somebody who was able to adapt and adjust and grow with the company, which is ideal because not everybody can grow with a company. Some people, are great at one stage, but maybe not the right person for the next stage. So it's really important to keep that in mind when you build a team.
Yeah, it's interesting. So if you consider idea stage, the research stage, a research project to a startup as 0 to 1, and 1 to X is from the startup stage to an exit. If you take these two phases, how have you both evolved in terms of building teams that are appropriate for each stage? Were there mistakes made previously in your previous startups, and how did you get this far?
You want to take that one, Dave, or you want me to start?
Sure. Like David mentioned at the very beginning, everybody has to throw their hat into the ring to be able to take on multiple different roles. And so I was, at the very beginning, I was writing offer letters. I was HR. David and I negotiated. So the company started out with a couple of key partnerships with other companies. And so I was reading all the contract and licensing agreements, CLAs, negotiating with the lawyers in the room with David. I don't think I was too bad at it either. Picked it up reasonably fast.
Very, very good at it, actually.
And these are like 100-page documents that are interwoven in very complex ways. And so we're negotiating for dozens of hours on a single CLA, and we did multiple CLAs, in addition to working to transition the technology and start building the team. David and I did a number of VC pitches together. We initially funded the company through partnerships rather than equity financing, but we were still talking to the VCs because we knew that at some point in the future we would need to do equity raises. And then as time went on, for each one of those functionalities, I really loved and enjoyed learning it. I always loved learning new things. But that said, as time goes on and the company grows, you need to bring in the people who are going to do those initially part-time as consultants and then full-time. And so my role I'm still on the board of directors of the company, greatly enjoy that. My role is as a consultant with the R&D team as far as my direct interactions with the company go. And that's a blast. That's great. I'm no longer doing HR or negotiating BD contracts. Thrilled that I got that exposure and that experience. It's going to benefit me for years to come. But yeah, like David mentioned, your role begins to specialize to where it is you can add the most value.
No, I was just going to say, you also asked sort of like, how do you build it and were mistakes made and you learn? And absolutely. I mean, so I'm fortunate. I think I'm on startup number 6 now, but you learn with each one. And one of the things, there were a couple of principles that we learned that we applied at 4D successfully. One is you have to be very careful who you take money from. It has a huge impact because there are a lot of investors out there whose model is to basically take a platform company like this and give lip service to the fact that you're going to build out a platform. But what they really want to do is bet the farm on a single product and see if it works and then try to sell you quickly. And I felt like from a business standpoint, but also just a moral standpoint, I had to defend and protect Dave's technology that he'd taken 15 years to develop at that point. Now it's over 20 years. But we agreed very early on, we did not want to lose control of this company to VCs who had a fundamentally different business model. And again, they're smart and they have every right to have a different business model. And it's fine because they diversify their risk across 15 different companies in each fund. But we wanted to be internally diversified and to really have multiple shots on goal and to build a big company. So that's Dave said, we elected to do very narrowly defined, targeted partnerships to get the funding to be able to build our capabilities in the lab and to prove out that this technology could actually not only work, but scale. And we felt that once we did that, we could then do financing rounds at a much better valuation where we're not going to lose control of the company. And that worked beautifully. But I will say, prior companies of mine, I sort of got in with investors who just fundamentally had a different vision, and it becomes a long, difficult road if you're not aligned on business model with your investors. So I think that was certainly one learning that we applied at 4D. The other is just that some employees will work out and some won't. No matter how hard you interview and do a job search, unless you've personally worked with that person before and know how they respond under pressure, you just don't know. So every new hire like that is an experiment, and some experiments work and some don't. And I think learning to move on from the ones that don't work more quickly is just another learning that came with years of doing this. I think, again, at 4D, the vast majority of our employees have worked out and had great runs with this, but not everybody does. And learning to move on and find the right person for the right fit as quickly as possible, I think, is also something that we applied.
Yeah, all great points. So Dave Schaefer was like putting on multiple hats. He enjoyed doing all of those so far. And we got to be careful about who you take money from. Let's go deeper into that thread. For early stage founders who are eager to raise money, they're not able to differentiate what good money and bad money is. Are there lessons of like how they navigate that tough path?
Absolutely. I think the first and foremost, raising money it's not necessarily a success, right? So you hear a lot of new entrepreneurs brag about how much money they raised and this and that. And that is not the way to look at it. There's good money and bad money. There's money that's aligned with your long-term vision. There's money that's not. Obviously, how much dilution did you take in the round is really important. And then there are all sorts of control provisions that investors get. If they get board seats, there are additional controls that they have at the board level. So it's really, I think, very, very important to look at the totality of the financing, not just, oh, I brought in X number of millions of dollars. You need to look very carefully at all these other things. And to get the right investor in, you might take more dilution because you say, hey, I'm okay with that because I'm confident they're aligned with my values. Somebody else you may not trust to give away control, and you may limit dilution and limit the rights that you give them. So I think you have to look at the totality of the financing. And likewise, when you look at business development as an alternative to doing a straight equity financing, you have to look at all the same features. How much of my future pipeline am I giving up? Is it worth the dilution of my future value, even though I'm not diluting my shareholdings today? So I would just encourage people when they look at these things, look at the total package and not just the dollar signs.
If you ask the question, or try to answer the question, what's the right amount of money to raise? My first response would be, what is the big value inflection you want to get to and how much money do you need to get there? Plus a cushion to be able to buffer risk, both internal risk as well as market risk. With the caveats that David mentioned, that if you can get in a really good investor and they want to come in with more or get a really good syndicate, then you would take more dilution then. But otherwise, I totally agree that talking about how many X million has been raised, it's more like how far can you get with what you've raised and how can you increase value in the company with what you've raised?
Yeah, and just to expand on that, I think of financing is sort of like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. You never stop, right? Because if you think about it, Dave said, you need at least a year typically, or a year and a half to build significant value such that your next financing is a higher price. That's the goal. And then you need at least 9 to 12 months of cash in the bank when you go out and do that next financing, or you'll be under extreme duress and have to accept very predatory terms. So you want to raise kind of 2 to 2.5 years worth of funding each time and make sure in that time frame that you can get the data you need to build value and then have plenty of time to raise the next round.
That's a great point. Maybe I'll go off on a different thread here. It's important to have a mindset about the timelines for any aspiring entrepreneur getting into a therapeutic or diagnostic. Can you frame a picture of how should they be thinking? It's not like 1 or 2 year journey. How should they prepare for this 8, 9, 10 year journey? If you can expand on that, that'll be very helpful to the audience.
I think it depends on the company, right? Some companies are single asset. I take a phase 2 product out of pharma. For some reason, they're walking away from it. I basically bring it in and I create a company to run a phase 3 trial, and that's it. Believe it or not, there are companies with that model. Be very, very short. If you want to take an early stage technology like we did, where Dave had done beautiful proof of concept work, but in terms of industrializing it, bringing it into products, we were really starting from scratch. We were building new libraries, we were building our capabilities, we were doing the primate selections, as Dave said, and only then could we start to create the product itself and then do all of the work that goes into filing an IND and building out your manufacturing and clinical teams. So, for us, it was clearly, this is a 10 to 15 year journey to get to the point where you really can see the fruits of your efforts in terms of multiple approved products that are changing people's lives. So I think it really varies depending on what you want to achieve. And I think each entrepreneur has to ask the question, how long do they want to stay with the company? Do they just want to get it launched and maybe get it public and then walk away and do something else and let somebody else run the company? Or do they want to stay with it for the duration as long as they can?
Great points. Dave, from an academic founder point of view, if you can throw some light on that.
Well, as David mentioned, you really have to. We decided that it was an area of technology where the implications or the applications could be pretty broad. So we could have gone quicker if we'd chosen one disease target and put all of our efforts into that and tried to drive 90 miles an hour in that sole direction. And we didn't. We felt that we wanted to fully build out the technology to go after multiple therapeutic areas. We knew it was going to take longer, but we wanted to have that patience because we felt that we always would say we wanted to become the Genentech of gene therapy, wanted to go after multiple targets that would develop in parallel to the point where now we have 3 human clinical trials ongoing. And as we've messaged to the street, we're going to be filing 2 INDs for the end of the year. So that was a journey that has taken now 8 years, but I'm thrilled with how far we've come.
Great. Thank you for that. And let's slightly shift gears into fundraising topic. Before we go on to the corporate side, Dave, how much money was brought in terms of R&D funding from research grants before 4DMT was launched?
Oh gosh, I did that calculation because we were trying to, if you're doing an equity raise, you need to, of course, try to justify your valuation. I remember adding up the total dollar amount of grants that had gone into the technology as, one little piece of data that could go into justifying a larger valuation. This had benefited from X millions. I think it was of order 10 million or so that went through my lab over the years to build up the technology.
Yeah,
but it's been a number of years since I took a look at that calculation.
Yeah. The reason I'm asking that question is so people can appreciate like how much work actually went into getting some proof of concept work done, getting done. David, let's get into the company point of view. Like from day one at 4DMT to IPO, maybe let's split that into 2 phases. You have seed, Series A, Series B, and I think you went till Series C. Tell us about that fundraising cycles.
Sure. So you have to have a clear business model and a clear goals when you go into the financing. So Dave and I agreed that we did not want to lose control of the company early. We felt that for this platform to see its full potential that it deserved, we needed to retain that control and that ability to develop it broadly. So we started with a series of partnerships. We had offers to be acquired, I think, within the first few months, just based on the excitement about what Dave had been doing academically. We sort of fended those off. We said, look, this is too early for us to be taken into another company. We want to take a shot at this ourselves. So we really settled on a strategy that would be a series of partnerships where we could deliver for partners better, best-in-class vectors for whatever disease indications that they wanted to develop. But we were really, really religious about maintaining the ownership of the vectors. Wherever possible, we didn't want our partners to own it. We wanted to own it. We wanted to control the intellectual property because it was critical that it was consolidated at 4D because that was our lifeblood. And then we were really religious about saying, look, we are going to give companies access to targets that they really want to develop, but nothing outside that. We don't want to have them lock up large numbers of product opportunities that then prevent us from going after those other indications. And so we really tried to thread that needle of getting enough funding to build out our capabilities, plus an extra cash for overhead, et cetera, but really limiting what we gave away to our partners. And that was difficult, as Dave said, for even very small partnerships. That was hundreds of hours of negotiation and pouring through these agreements. And one of the advantages I think we have is that Dave's understanding of the technology and how it would be developed was a real, I think, advantage when we had those conversations with companies. We really understood what terms we could live with and which we couldn't. So a number of those were cash upfront plus funding for research, which allowed us to hire people, pay for our lab overhead, et cetera. And then we did several of those with smaller companies. And then I think really a transformative one for us was with Pfizer, where it came with significant cash upfront and equity investment that really helped us build out the company more broadly and let us start developing our own products. We did get a early investment from a very unusual investment company, sort of more of an angel investor type. So that was sort of the first phase. And then once we've been doing that for, I think, 2 or 3 years and really proven out the technology and had a pipeline and we started to build manufacturing, then we did a very large Series B with a totally different group of investors, so-called crossover investors, who will invest in late stage private companies as well as in an IPO and even in public companies. And we really were excited to get in with that group of investors in the Series B and then the Series C to follow because they had a much longer time horizon. These weren't funds that were looking to get in and out of our stock quickly. We felt they were aligned with our goals of going public and remaining independent. And they're the kind of funds that don't require a huge number of control provisions the way a early stage VC might. So that was sort of it. Dave's grants translating into very small targeted partnerships, plus a seed investment, and then a larger partnership and investment with Pfizer, and then a successful Series B with, I think on the order of 10 very high quality crossover funds, and then a C to really tee us up for a successful IPO, which was the next step.
Yeah. I mean, you both have done a phenomenal job of finding partnerships with companies, both small and big, I'm guessing. How do you pick partners? I assume they play a big role, especially for therapeutic and diagnostic companies. What was your selection process for picking partners?
Well, maybe Dave could start by speaking to kind of how most of these partners found us and what are some of the considerations we had when we considered partnerships.
Yeah, at the very beginning, it was the case that gene therapy was heating up. People were recognizing, for two reasons, they were recognizing they needed novel AAV variants. One is that some people were beginning to see the limitations of the natural versions. And the second is people needed access to IP, that a lot of those were patented, and people were barred from getting into the field as a result. And we were not just a technology engine, but we've been an IP engine as well, created a large amount of new IP, a lot of new AAV variants. So at the very beginning, people were coming to us. It was kind of interesting that I've been in gene therapy now for almost 30 years. And for much of that time, like David mentioned, fields go through kind of boom and bust. Gene therapy had risen up in the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s, and then crashed down when the wrong technology was being used and there were adverse events in clinical trials. And then some people stuck with it and began to battle past the technological hurdles, including delivery, so that when the field started showing signs of succeeding again, we had this technology that could give people access to great vectors and new IP. So people were coming to us at the beginning. I was getting emails regularly from the companies that you would know of or that you've heard of, including Pfizer and numerous others. So then it turns into, just like David said, with VCs or investors, it's a matter of alignment, ensuring that you have a really good complementarity, that what you want to do is compatible with what they want to do. You have a technology, they have a clinical need. In addition, there's going to be lots of touch points along the entire way as you navigate through the collaboration, through the partnership. And so it's really good to have people that are very professional in managing partnerships, have really good alliance management. But we've benefited from that in a number of cases. And just like in a equity financing, there's a lot of additional terms beyond the valuation and the money that's coming in. In a partnership, the CLAs, it's a 100-page document. There are lots of details. How broad is the field? What product rights do they get? How long does the time during which they get to nominate or select their product candidates, how long does that last? When does the research and development need to be complete? Just in general, how broad rights do they get as a result of the partnership? So in addition, like David mentioned, it's important who you take money from. That extends to partnerships, of course, as well. That partnering with a Pfizer, that's a blue chip company, and that lends credibility to you as well. So it ends up being kind of the totality of all of those interactions, the complementary nature of the technology with their clinical need, coming to agreement on financials, as well as all the other aspects of the agreement, and how big a name are they, which quite simply benefits you if you're going into an equity raise saying that we have a partnership with Pfizer.
Can you talk more about, you wanted to give the best experience you had with one of these partners beyond the money and the name they bring at a personal level? How did that relation evolve and help you evolve as a company as well?
Yeah, sure. I think when we think about business development and partnerships, they bring three core value drivers. One is obviously cash. The other is capabilities. In some cases, you're partnering with somebody who has clinical development or commercialization engine in the therapeutic area that you just don't have yet, or they might have expertise in manufacturing that you don't necessarily have yet. So I think it's cash, it's capabilities, and then it's validation. And early on in a company's evolution and development, every investor, every potential partner, even vendors, employees, they're all looking for that external validation of your company, right? They say, okay, this guy, these guys seem to be excited. They seem to have a great vision, but boy, how do I know it's real? And if you get the right investors in, if you get the right partners in, that lends that credibility is extremely valuable. Now, once your company's public, you're going to be valued on your clinical data and eventually the sales of your product. But when you're trying to get something off the ground, that external validation can be very important. So when I think of a partnership, I ask the question, is this company going to bring us significant cash and or direct research funding that will also have value for us? Can we leverage their research funding to also use this to get vectors that we can use in our own products, which in many cases was the case? Are they going to bring unique capabilities that we don't have? Technology for a specific transgene class, perhaps that we don't have, or expertise in a certain therapeutic area? And then are they validated? And frankly, some companies were and others aren't. So I think you have to look at the totality of the situation when you make a decision. In terms of running the partnership, it's difficult because by definition, almost, these companies will have different business models. They'll have a different risk appetite. They'll have different access to capital to develop the products, different timelines, different vision of how to manage relationships with the FDA. So it's tricky. The cultures almost by definition aren't going to match ideally, and you have to find a way to govern these and manage these relationships that benefits both parties and try to create those win-wins. But it's not easy. As you imagine, a large pharmaceutical company may have a very different sense of what a reasonable timeline is as compared to a company at kind of that early dynamic private company stage.
I don't think it was ever coincidence that people were finding you. You have built a long success record. They know you for a while. But for an early stage startup, how do they go about these partnerships? Where do they start? If this is advice you're giving to some early stage founder.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in on the comment that you had earlier, which is that it's very, very valuable to have a network and to cultivate and build a network. And so most early stage companies start out by trying to work their network, trying to have somebody introduce them to somebody to introduce them to somebody to try to get inroads if they don't already have them.
No, that's spot on. One of the fortunate things for me in my career is, for a while I was starting up one of my companies, I ran a consulting practice and I consulted in the biologics field and in viral vector gene therapy field for several years. And I had probably 15 different companies that I worked with. And so when it came time to build my next company, I had a pool of potential employees that I recruit. And I had a nice network of business development people at these companies that I could go back to and say, hey, you've been in this area. What do you think about moving into this area? Would you be interested? And in many cases, that's really paid off. And so it's really about that network. I think successful academic professors like Dave, they'll have a network of people that they know both in academia and in industry that you can leverage. Bankers, if you talk to investment bankers who want your business down the road when you're successful, they should be willing to do work for you early on. And they may be able to introduce you to people in business development at these companies. So yeah, it's really a team sport, and it's really just creating and building your network.
Great. Thank you on that. And I want to close the loop on the fundraising. So you're done with Series C. I'm assuming you had an option of going to D and E versus going IPO. Talk me through the process, how you've gone through and went to the IPO.
Sure. So, Dave and I have been talking about it for years. And again, our guiding principle was just going public is not equated with success. You have to go public in the right way, at the right stage of the company, with the right team, the right board. Just, again, getting public in and of itself, it's not a successful exit yet. It's not even that your company is going to be successful or have any impact on patients. It's just another round of financing that happens to be access a larger pool of capital so you can raise more and get more investors into the stock. We really wanted to guard against going public too soon and then having some sort of problem with manufacturing or development timelines that could really set us back. So we, in fact, had been on track to go public probably a year earlier and held off and said, look, we've had some delays in some preclinical programs that we want to get right before we go public. So let's do a Series C and then go public after we achieve specific product development milestones, which is what we did. And so we took a little bit of extra dilution before going public. But I think because of that, we were a much stronger company, a much higher valued company when we did go public. And I think we went public with a product portfolio where I felt we'd really de-risked the situation. We weren't relying on the readout from one single product or one single clinical trial. We had a portfolio of products, a diverse portfolio that gave us multiple shots on goal. So that's how I think of an IPO. It's just another financing round, but you just want to make sure that you do it when you're ready, because the markets are brutal. And if you go public too early and then you have a setback, it may take you a decade to recover from that, literally. So you have to be really, really careful. And, I think when we were ready, the market was ready as well.
Dave, any thoughts on that?
No, I fully agree. I think that just as one shouldn't measure success in how much money has been raised on the private market, how big a raise was, one shouldn't measure success by how quickly they did the IPO. I think, like David mentioned, do an IPO, well, you're getting access to a much broader range of potential sources of capital, the entire public market. And that's a time where that's really important for the company to be able to scale and invest in their clinical programs, invest in manufacturing, and really begin to grow. And until you're at that stage where having access to the public market can really, really benefit a company, there's no reason to rush it.
Dave, a lot of this excitement about valuations and companies going to IPO comes from the tech industry, I guess, where they go on to raise billions of dollars. I wish the enthusiasm and definitely the money would spread to the biotech industry as well. But regardless, as you mentioned, raising money in the public markets does have its benefits. Well, your success so far makes me curious about how you evolved as business leaders. What are the things you did early on in life that prepared you for this? Dave and David, neither of you have a business degree, but you have done phenomenally well with your startups. Can you talk about the evolution process?
Yeah, if I could add some thoughts initially. So early on with the first partnership that 4D closed, one of the terms of that was that I stepped onto the board of directors of the partner company. And it was just prior to the company going public. The IPO, I think, was in February 2014. We closed the partnership in January 2014. And so I kind of got to see that company grow and they've had all you have to do is look at their stock price. And they had a couple little rough points along the way where the company was trying to find its way. And one of the big things was the C-suite. And you really need to have the expertise present within the C-suite or within the leadership as a whole for an earlier stage company. And that can take many forms. So initially they had a PhD at CEO, but they had a really strong CFO. And then there was transition or turnover at the CEO position, and the CFO, who was an MBA without a scientific background, stepped into being CEO. But they ended up getting a really strong CMO, a really good CTO. So you need to have expertise and leadership capabilities in all these complex areas that it takes to get a company to successfully grow and to get a drug into clinical development and then ultimately approved. But you can have balance in multiple ways across the C-suite. Of course, it all starts with the CEO. You need a very capable person at the helm. But as they know that they don't have expertise across the entire board, so you really build up a strong C-suite to complement and to back up the CEO.
Yeah, I think it's all about the team. CEOs, again, I think the number one job is building the compelling vision and business model. And then it's the team. And then again, making the tough decisions that it sort of can't be decided by your team on their own. So there are lots of different models for successful CEOs. There are CEOs that are incredibly charismatic. That's not me, but there are some like that, or come out of the sales organizations, perhaps. There are some that come out of the finance world. There are some that are PhD scientists. So I don't think there's one model, but I do think you have to be able to set and communicate a compelling vision. I mean, so much of what the CEO does is communication. You have to have a great vision to start with and technology, but then you have to be able to communicate it, because all you're doing all day, every day is trying to persuade people, right? Whether it's persuade them to join your company or to take a new position in your company or to do a partnership with you or to invest in you or to join your board, you're constantly persuading. So regardless of your background, you have to be a really good communicator, and you have to be able to communicate to all different kinds of audience. One moment you'll be talking to a MD, PhD from an Ivy League college on your science and development program. The next you're talking to an investor maybe who comes from the finance world, and you have to be able to talk to all these different groups equally effectively. So I think regardless of your background, if you can set a compelling vision, if you can communicate it and persuade people and build a great team, you can succeed. I do think that at this stage of the company where we're still learning about the science and integrating it with the medicine and the regulatory strategy and the business and finance strategy, you have to really, I think, have a working knowledge of all of that. By definition, you shouldn't be the expert in the company in any of that. Hopefully you're recruiting people who are better than you and deeper than you in all of those areas. But you have to be the symphony conductor who brings it all together and have enough of a working knowledge in each of these areas that you can bring it all together. I think that may change one day when we're commercial. Maybe we have multiple products on the market and whatnot. Maybe the CEO phenotype at that point should be somebody who's more of a commercial guy and who knows how to build out international sales organizations. But for now, where we are, which is just early stage clinical development, I think it's really important to have a working knowledge in all those areas.
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, a lot of good points there, like being able to set a good vision, being able to communicate well, recruit people better than you in areas which you lack the knowledge about. And I think PhDs can do a good job. The reason I asked that question is because there's a narrative out there that if you're a scientist, you need to go get an MBA to build a company. So I've been seeing both sides of it. So I'm trying to see how PhDs can evolve. Thank you for that. Let's shift the gears into something. I want to make this a little, I don't want to make everything look like so fun and easy. I'm sure there were challenges during this journey. 8 years, is that what it was since founding the startup?
Yeah.
If you can touch base on, there are always co-founder issues like misunderstandings. Were there any misunderstandings as co-founders between you, and how did you overcome those things? This again is purely from how others embarking on this journey should think about co-founder issues and how they can overcome those things.
Dave, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think it comes down to communication. That I think if you spend lots of time with any person, you're going to end up running into misunderstandings. It could be your best friend, it could be your family. It's just a matter of communicating so that you understand where people are coming from. And as long as people are mature and reasonable, and you can get through those. So I didn't find any extraordinarily unusual concerns along the way. I think David and I have been really well aligned the vast majority of the time.
The way I think about it is it's almost like a marriage and you're raising a kid together, and in my belief is that you really need to be aligned on your core values and why you're doing this. Because if you're not, whether it's a marriage or a co-founder partnership, it's just not going to work. And so I think finding somebody that you respect, trust, and then where you have an aligned vision for what you're trying to create. And I think I've worked with a lot of co-founders and scientific co-founders, and Dave is by far the best I've been lucky enough to work with. And a lot of that is I have deep respect for his intelligence and his work ethic. But I think as important as all of that is we were aligned on what we wanted to build. We said, we're not in it for a quick buck. We're not in it to flip the company. We're not in it to just raise a bunch of money and from any investor. We had a very aligned belief in what we wanted to build together. And I think that's the central feature. If you trust and respect each other and you have an aligned vision, that can get you through essentially anything. There are definitely going to be bumps on the road. I mean, I'm sure there are things that I've done that Dave has been wondering about. And there have been times where I had to reach out to Dave and say, hey, I need more of your time right now. We really need you right now. And every time I did that, he immediately stepped into the breach and did what I needed for a financing or a partnership or a board member or anything else. So I agree. It's about that communication, and it's got to be built on a mutual trust, respect, and aligned values.
Thank you so much. So many important points in there. The trust, I think that's the center core for all relations, I believe. Well, the next question I was going to ask you was, were there any consequential, crucial decisions you had to take, like individually, Dave and David, along the journey, that if you didn't take those decisions, the company wouldn't be here? If you can remember one each, both on the scientific end, Dave, and on the business side, David.
Scientifically, I can't think of one single big one. I think that a lot of the key decisions that have guided the company or changed the direction of the company have been business. Every time it came time to raise money, David, who did this in a very smart way, tried to create optionality. You don't necessarily want to go into a negotiation where you're only negotiating with one entity. Otherwise, you don't have leverage. So whether it was multiple equity investors or whether it was potential partners, or in some cases there was a competitive situation where it was an equity investment versus a partnership. And so, I can remember a number of those along the way where it ended up changing the direction of the company a little bit. It's always been upward, but I think David can probably remember key partnerships the day we closed. It all of a sudden transformed the company, and a fusion of capital and capability and momentum, made a big difference for the company. Scientifically, we've continued to innovate, continue to push, continue to improve the technology. But in that case, I think it's kind of an integration of thousands of decisions. No huge one, I think, that really made a course-altering change for the technology. What are your thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, from a business side, I think there's no one way to build a company. There's no one right way. It really depends on the technology, the state of the field, and what the co-founders and entrepreneurs' goals are together for building a company. So from a business standpoint, again, there's not one way to build a company. I think it just depends on the situation and the macro environment and your technology and what you want to achieve as co-founders and entrepreneurs. I will say for us, our goal was really to maintain that independence such that we could build out the platform broadly to develop lots of different products for different therapeutic areas and patient populations. And so when I think about deals that we walked away from that made a huge difference early on, we had a company that wanted to acquire us. And for Dave and I, we could have made a very quick return on our time investment and walked away with a bunch of cash, but we wouldn't have achieved what we set out to achieve. And so it was easy, I think, for us to say no to that. We had another company who said, okay, well, if you won't merge with us, why don't you give us all your rare disease product candidates and you guys can go off and do large market. We thought about that. We said, no, we really need to keep this integrated together. So those are a couple examples of decisions that we made where we walked away from something that, with the perspective we have now, I'm really glad we did, because had we done those deals, we certainly wouldn't be the broad, diversified, fully integrated company that we now can become.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And I know you're trying to cure diseases, and in your opinions, are there inflection points that will speed up the progress that 4DMT has made to date? What are other dependencies that will catalyze this speeding up process for you?
Well, I think for us, now that we're a publicly traded company, we're in the clinic, it's all about proving out in the clinic, in patients, that our technology and products work the way they were designed to work. Because now with clinical validation, we not only validate that product, we can validate the underlying vector that we discovered and is proprietary to 4D, which has implications for other products in that therapeutic area. And then we also are validating the underlying technology, the directed evolution, where Dave was the first to apply that to AAV. And so we're really at a very exciting point here where in the next quarter, we'll be releasing initial clinical data on 3 different programs. And then next year, again, we'll have 2 more clinical programs. So I think for this stage of development, it's going to be all about the clinical results that drive the company value, drive the next financing round. Having been said, Dave and I believe deeply that we have to keep investing in the platform and the pipeline. So that's something we're going to make sure we raise enough money to do both, not only deliver in the clinic where we have to from just an investor standpoint, but also make that investment in the platform that'll pay off years down the road.
Excellent. Any closing thoughts from you, Dave?
No, I think that's exactly right. We had a value proposition to our investors, and to also we've had the fortunate development within the company to work with a number of patient disease advocacy groups. And so we've proposed how we're going to provide value to our investors. It's also very, very important to us. And this is where the company started, so providing value to our patients, to the people who absolutely need technologies like the ones we're trying to develop. So if we can achieve success in clinical trials, then both of those become successful.
Absolutely.
Dave, and I'm glad, if I could just echo that, I'm glad you raised that point because I meant to mention it earlier. The patient advocacy organizations can be incredible partners for companies at early stages. They can provide funding. They can provide expertise on regulatory endpoints, expertise on clinical trial designs. They can be validating. And so we were fortunate to have a number of partnerships with patient advocacy organizations, all the way from Choroideremia Research Foundation, which is a rare ophthalmology disease group. It's one of the first we worked with, all the way up to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which is a multi-billion-dollar organization and put over $20 million into the company over time. But those partnerships with those advocacy organizations are incredibly valuable because you're completely aligned in terms of what you want to achieve for patients.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard a lot about these patient advocacy groups, and I think there's something other entrepreneurs should look up to. Thank you for sharing that note. And my closing questions, I ask this to everybody. What are a couple of lessons you learned in building 4DMT that others could benefit from, and any mistakes that others could avoid?
So I've enjoyed becoming a serial entrepreneur. I've co-founded 6 companies now, which has been an absolute blast. It's been incredibly fulfilling, not just for my career, but for myself as a person, to be able to try to take the product of what I'm doing and translate it towards benefiting society. I think there were a few things that we really got right that have helped with other companies. There were earlier companies, I won't mention the name, but I've been involved in a company or 1 or 2 that have gone out too early, where the technology wasn't quite ripe yet and where the market for it hadn't quite developed yet. And in that case, it's a little bit of an uphill climb. You come in too late, then all of a sudden you're just standing in line. Lots of folks are already developing technologies. So I think we hit the timing absolutely perfectly. That's one big lesson that I've enjoyed learning. And other lessons are absolutely, continue to foster and build your network. We've hit on that a couple of times already, because that has a huge amount of value. And the more that life goes on, the larger your network should become. The more people you should really know, and the more relationships you should be really fostering. And then that translates directly into building out an incredible team. People you would love to have complementary expertise, common vision, and terrific communication, and an incredible work ethic within the company. So those are all qualities that I've really enjoyed trying to build and bring into multiple companies now. So the list, I'm sure, goes on, but I'll hand the mic to David.
Great. Timing and networking. David?
Yeah, I think that timing point is a great one. I just think understanding your technology, understanding your customer, right? At the end of the day, this is a business. So you might have really cool science, really cool technology, but at the end of the day, you need a customer, you don't have a business. So whether that customer is an investor who's going to put money into you to help you develop your products, or a potential partner, I think that really needs to be aligned. And that's all about not only your technology, but timing, as Dave said. You have to hit that sweet spot. I've been a founder of companies that were just ahead of their time, and it was brutal. But if I were to start that same company today, given the current environment, it would be a slam dunk. So that timing is really critical. I'd say the other thing is, again, you can't spend too much time on your vision. And what I mean by that is, what is your purpose? What is that purpose that you exist for that never changes? For us, we're boldly innovating to unlock the full potential of gene therapy for millions of patients. That won't change. Our strategy will change, our milestones will change, our goals will change, but that shouldn't change. So I think developing your vision statement where you have a clear purpose, a clear set of goals for 5 years or mission, some people call that your mission, a strategy to get there, and then guiding principles or culture that helps you say, how do we want to do our work together? How do we build our team? How do we evaluate people? For us, it's dare to cure. It's relentless preparation and execution. It's breaking boundaries and thinking beyond yourself. And we use those in every single day when we hire, when we evaluate, when we think about how we work together. And so I think spending that time to get that right with your co-founders is really critical. Building the right team and moving on. If you make a bad hire, then admit it quickly, move on. And then the term I love as a CEO is called constructive paranoia. And what that means is you have to be paranoid. You have to be thinking that things might be going great, but you have to be asked the question, what could go wrong? What are all the things that could go wrong? And then have plan A, plan B, plan C, and think of that ahead of time so you're not flat-footed. So it doesn't mean being paranoid and just in a state of shock and unable to move. And it also doesn't mean, I'm just building everything for success, assuming everything's going to be fine. It means finding that middle ground where you think carefully about all the risk areas. What can you do to mitigate that risk? And then what's your plan A, plan B, and plan C for each of those eventualities? And I think that's a way to have a healthy, thriving company, because there are going to be bumps in the road. The technology is not always going to work. Clinical trials aren't always going to work, but if you build it the right way, you can weather the storm and continue to successfully build a big company.
Love it. Dare to cure, and only the constructive have constructive paranoia. Andy Grove says, only the paranoid survive. And going to the last question, name one or two people that played a significant role in your startup journeys that helped you get this far. Dave, you want to go?
One is another person on this call. I think, David, I had a big influence on my career in life. I've learned a huge amount, and I've really enjoyed seeing the technologies that we developed have an opportunity to be able to make it all the way to the clinic. Hopefully, like you mentioned, data that are developing end up ultimately being positive at the time we are ready to disclose. So fingers crossed, looking ahead for the future of the technology. And I thank David a lot for teaching me a huge amount in the journey along the way. I've had a number of mentors and colleagues within UC Berkeley who have been terrific. Too many to really call out or mention, but a number of senior people where reached out to ask a question, and they were generous with their time and with their coffee. And I learned a huge amount in the 22 years I've been at Berkeley as well. I've also developed a number of friendships within industry. Legal folks, Alan Mendelson has been a terrific person to interact with. He was lead external corporate counsel for 4D until his recent retirement. And we've been thrilled to be able to bring him back as a consultant within the company, as well as some of the investors in the company who are colleagues, and a number of other executives at other companies that you learn a lot from many different people. You quoted Andy Grove. Another person to quote is Warren Buffett for me, which is that surround yourself with really smart people and learn from them.
Awesome. David?
Yeah, well, I think, right back at you, Dave. I learned a tremendous amount from you, and it's been a great partnership and really a model, I think, for kind of co-founder partnership I want to have with all of my companies going forward. Yeah, so I've been very fortunate to have a number of different mentors and collaborators throughout my career and with 4D. Certainly Frank McCormick, the UCSF Cancer Center Director and co-founder of Onyx Pharmaceuticals, was really the first person who introduced me to a career in biotech. Mark Robinson from Centerview, really the leading M&A life sciences banker in the world. and friend from my undergraduate days at Cal, has been a real supporter throughout my career. And my co-founders, Dave Schaefer and Teresa Janke at 4D and other companies, have really been phenomenal partners. I certainly wouldn't have the success I had to date without them. And my wife, Kristen, and my daughters have given me endless guidance and support over the years. So I really have to thank them. I think in terms of getting 4D funded and really accelerating its growth, I have to thank Marin Winnick at Evercore, just one of the top life sciences bankers who really saw what we were trying to do and understood our vision and really captured it. And then our major investors at Viking, led by Rohan Narodi, really made a huge difference in the growth of 4D and our ability to progress and eventually go public.
Hey, biotech indeed is the ultimate team sport. Hey, David, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing the story of 4DMT. And you both have been my mentors of sort for a long time now. I appreciate you taking the time, and I continue to learn. And good luck to both of you with 4DMT.
Thank you so much, Naresh.
Thanks, Naresh. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.